Hello, I'm Robert M Ellis, and welcome to the third of this series of talks on the Buddha's Middle Way. I'm just going to briefly recap the first couple of talks before I get on to the Buddha's Ministry, which is the title of this talk. So far in the series, I've talked about the Buddha's early life. So that's where we started with the Buddha's life in the palace, going forth into the forest, and then discovering the middle way. That was the theme of the first talk. And there my key message was the way that the middle way is modelled symbolically by the Buddha's early life. So there's a process of discovering the middle way, but it also can be an inspiration for us in finding the middle way, in modelling it and symbolising it. So the middle way, as I see it, models a universal principle of judgment. That is, when we're avoiding absolute states on either side, absolute ways of judging on either side, where we assume that we've got the whole story. So the palace and the forest both represent those sorts of communities with authorities that believe they have the whole story, and the Buddha recognised that neither of them did, and that he needed to seek an understanding between those absolute extremes. I then, in the second talk, talked about the Enlightenment and the difficulties there are with the relationship between the Enlightenment and the middle way, because the Enlightenment is prone to absolute interpretations, because it's discontinuous, seen as a sudden move into a completely different state, and therefore a basis of authority claims, absolute authority claims. But I also argued that enlightenment can be interpreted in ways that are led by the middle way, that recognise the middle way as how we work in experience, in human experience, recognising ordinary human uncertainty, and that we can interpret the stories of the Enlightenment and the Buddha's attainment of enlightenment within those terms in order to find something that's inspiring and relevant to us today in our lives, rather than just this sort of absolute attainment, which then becomes the basis of absolute authority claims in the tradition. So this time I'm now going to go on to talk about the Buddha's ministry. So by ministry I mean the period really from the Buddha's enlightenment to his death. So probably a period of something around 50 years or so, as far as we can tell from the stories. Interesting parallel here with Jesus, who also had a period of ministry which was only supposed to be 3 years, however. So the Buddha had a much longer period of ministry. And obviously ministry means he's wandering around talking to people about his understanding of the path and how to practice it. So there are many episodes in the period of the ministry, which for me illustrate further how to put the middle way into action, really, as well as obviously things that the Buddha taught which help people to practice the middle way. Again, I think we need to be critical and selective, so not everything that the Pali Canon says about the Buddha's ministry and his teachings is that helpful, but there are lots of things that are. So it's good to try and separate the wheat from the chaff as far as we can, try and develop some criteria for doing so. So obviously I've only got up to an hour's talk here. I can't possibly talk about everything in the Buddha's ministry. Really the Buddha's ministry is told in a huge number of suttas in the Pali Canon. So a third, one of the three baskets of the Pali Canon, the Sutta Pitaka, consists of hundreds and hundreds of suttas which tell the story of the Buddha's encounters with various people. So all of them really tell us about Buddha's ministry, what he said and what he did, and how he related to people during that time. So obviously there's a huge amount of material there. So all I can do is pick out a few key moments, particularly key moments that I think illustrate the middle way and its importance and can be inspiring in that way. So I'm going to talk first of all about the Buddha's decision to teach. So why did he do that in the first place? You know, it's quite a thing to go out and stake your life on telling people about this thing you think you've discovered and drop everything else, as it were. Takes a lot of courage. So the decision to teach is quite interesting in many ways, I think. Then there's also his first address, or first sermon as it's often called, which gives the basics of his teachings and is extremely interesting from that point of view. Then I'll say a little bit about his general approach to teaching, so a few general observations about how he taught. And if I've got time, I might say a little bit about the Buddha's politics and about how he approached death. But basically, as I say, there's limited time to talk about all these things, and if you want more details, you'll find more about those points in the book, The Buddha's Middle Way, which is what this series of talks is based on. So just a reminder before I go on that the Buddha's Middle Way is published by Equinox, and if you decide you want to buy it, the best place to do that is the Equinox website, where you can get a 25% discount on the book by putting in the code EQX. So I'd recommend that rather than going straight to Amazon or whatever. Okay, so going on then. So a little bit about the decision to teach, first of all. Now, if you think about the situation when the Buddha, as the story goes, attained enlightenment, he's then left kind of thinking, well, what next? What do I do with this? I've had this tremendous realization. Perhaps I've gone past this huge tipping point. Perhaps that's the way I suggested we think about the enlightenment last time, as this recognition of things. So what do I do with this? How can I possibly communicate this in the first place? So this is where we get the story of his encounter with Brahma Sahampati, as he's called. So Brahma Sahampati, this picture is, well, you might not like the style of it, I don't know, but it's an example of a traditional picture. It's one of the few that actually depicts this scene that I've managed to find. And it's interesting and typically Buddhist in that it depicts Brahma, who is basically God, as smaller, about a third the size of the Buddha. And then Brahma behind him, I think, has lots of devas and devis, other gods who are emphasizing his power and influence and so on. This is an early example in the chronology of the stories, anyway, of the gods being subsidiary to the Buddha in the Buddhist account of things. And but it's interesting though that Brahma, or God, comes to beg the Buddha to teach and to offer him some perspective as well. And I think this fits very well with the understanding I've gradually arrived at of the figure of God. That is, not only in Hinduism, obviously in Christianity and so on as well, of God as an archetypal figure, which can be a source of inspiration, because he's actually appearing here in the Pali Canon, in the life of the Buddha, pretty much in that role. So he's reminding the Buddha of various perspectives he might have forgotten. He's giving him another angle on things, reminding him of wider potential, and at his best, as it were, particularly in the the mystical traditions in the theistic religions, God seems to have that role. It opens people's minds, or experiences of God open people's minds to new vast potential beyond what they previously recognised. And the Buddha's achievement here, I think, is listening to that voice and being open to it, which is itself an achievement. So you can see that as a voice within him, like some of the other voices we see in the story. So I mentioned in the last talk about Mara. So Mara represents the if you like, the reactive forces within him, the craving and the hatred and so on, which are trying to bring him back to an absolute perspective from the middle way. But in this case, it's an encouraging voice, and it's a bigger voice when he is inclined to identify with too narrow a perspective. So there are two major things that the Buddha, as it were, discusses with Brahma, or where Brahma gives him a perspective. The first is about finding a teacher, or I think this must surely be associated also with not having a group. So the Buddha's by himself. He's stuck his neck out, as it were, leaving the group of ascetics he was with to pursue his own path, the middle way. He must have felt very isolated, because human beings are social beings. What do I do now? You might be thinking. And the way this is put in the text is that he can't find a teacher to revere. There's no existent teacher that he can revere anymore. But Brahma Sahampati, Brahma the father of all, what that literally means, offers a suggestion. That is, that he can honour, respect, and dwell in dependence on this very Dhamma. So the Dhamma, or Dharma, is the traditionally translated as teaching, quite often in Buddhist language. Now this word Dhamma or Dharma can be tricky, because it can also be used, and has been used quite often, to mean something like absolute reality. I think that will be contradictory for the reasons I've outlined in the earlier talks. So the middle way, if we're starting with the middle way as our sort of root approach, putting it first, the middle way involves avoiding claims of absolute perspectives. So the Dhamma or Dharma in this case, I think, means something like an understanding of the middle way, an understanding of a path which takes us forward, and therefore something universal. So it's how any person can develop, and how any person can find a way to continue to overcome the limitations that are restricting them. So it's interesting here, I think, that Brahma is urging really a universal view on the Buddha, and obviously here the Buddha is not a Buddhist. Buddhism didn't exist, so if we're to be inspired by what the Buddha's inspirations were, his inspiration was the middle way itself, as far as I can see. But again, I'm not making any historical claims here. This is all within the symbolism of the story, basically. So that's the first question he discusses with Brahma Sahampati. The second one, though, is about teaching itself. So should he teach? And the difficulty the Buddha has is that it seems so difficult to communicate what he wants to communicate and what he has to communicate. And the text puts this over rather well, I think. So I'll read you a little bit from it. So I consider this is the Buddha telling later what happened to him. So I considered, I considered this Dhamma that I have attained is profound, hard to see and hard to understand, peaceful and sublime, unattainable by mere reasoning, subtle, to be experienced by the wise. But this generation delights in adhesion or attachment, takes delight in attachment, rejoices in attachment. It is hard for such a generation to see this truth, namely specific conditionality, dependent origination. If I were to teach the Dhamma, others would not understand me, and that would be wearying and troublesome for me. Considering thus, my mind inclined to inaction rather than teaching the Dhamma. Okay, now there are terms there which I'm not going to go into now, so I will talk in future talk about conditionality and about attachment. But the key thing here is that it all seems so difficult for him. And he's only considering really two alternatives, it seems. He's considering the alternative of teaching, which would be really difficult. It will be worrying and troublesome. It will be stressful. Being by himself, trying to communicate to people who won't listen, is pretty damn stressful. So there's that possibility, and then there's not teaching at all. So inaction. And just as it were, I suppose dwelling in contentment would be the alternative. And the role of Brahma then is to remind the Buddha, actually there's another way of looking at this, there's a third option. You don't have to stress yourself out or do nothing. You can actually do some good whilst looking after yourself. So there's basically Brahma Sahampati pleads with him in the way the text gives it. Brahma Sahampati pleads with him to teach the Dhamma for the welfare of people. And then the Buddha reconsiders his position, and the way he summarises this is as follows. So, surveying the world with the eyes of a Buddha, I saw beings with little dust in their eyes, and with much dust in their eyes, with keen faculties and with dull faculties, with good qualities and with bad qualities, easy to teach and hard to teach, and some who dwelt seeing fear and blame in the other world. So he notices, he realises that there were some people with little dust in their eyes, or with but little dust in their eyes, some people who will be receptive, and therefore that his effort would be worth engaging with. But he only recognises that because he's got beyond his initial limited framing of the situation and begun to engage with this more positive framing. So there again we've got an application of the middle way, here inspired by Brahma, rather like the picture of the two mules which I showed in the first talk. So there's a point where the mules are tugging against each other, trying to eat two different piles of hay, but then they reconsider. They no longer have to push against each other. They could work together to eat each pile of hay in turn. So they reframe the situation, going beyond those two absolute alternatives. So it's at that point the Buddha not only seems to have found a way forward, but he's found some confidence in his situation despite uncertainty and difficulty. And that confidence, as I think I mentioned in the previous talk, so confidence needs to be based on our bodily states and on our imagination. So despite recognition of uncertainty, we can be confident, and the Buddha again illustrates this. Okay, and then there's another very interesting episode just at the beginning of his ministry here, that the Buddha then goes out to preach the Dharma, to teach others, and the very first person he meets is called Upaka. And kind of comically, it doesn't work out very well. So the Buddha approaches Upaka, who greets him on the road, and he bursts out with, "I am the one who has transcended all, a knower of all. I have no teacher, and one like me exists nowhere in all the world. I alone am a fully enlightened one." And Upaka obviously thinks he's a bit loopy. And so when all this was said, the Ajivaku Upaka said, "May it be so, friend." Shaking his head, he took a bypath and departed. So it's very interesting, I think, that the Buddha starts off with a mistaken approach. He has to make a mistake in order to begin to find his way. He starts off with this overinflated idea of who he is and what he has to offer, and the idea that everybody, sort of messianic sense that everybody ought to accept it immediately, exactly as he offers it. And like any of us, he has to moderate his message to the audience. So that's the beginning of it. But then we get a slightly more successful communication, which is the first address or the first sermon. So I'll go on to that. So we can think of this in terms of episodes, if you like. So the Brahma Sahampati episode is over, but the episode of the what's known as first turning of the wheel of the Dhamma. So the sutta that this is found in is called Turning the Wheel of the Dhamma, and it's often described as the Buddha's first sermon. So again, this is a traditional picture of it, and it just shows the Buddha teaching the 5 ascetics who he met earlier. So the first people who he tries to communicate with after Upaka are the 5 ascetics. And as you would expect, he split up with the 5 ascetics earlier. Their relationship broke up. The band broke up, you could say, and so there's going to be some difficulties when they for them to come back together. And at first, they plot, the 5 ascetics, when they see him approaching, they plot not to show him the usual civilities as he approaches, and then somehow, according to the text, find themselves doing so because they're so impressed by how he looks. But then, they do become reasonably friendly, but they just address him as friend, and the Buddha at first takes umbrage at this. He thinks they ought to address him more respectfully because he's enlightened. But he manages to get over that again, so there's a bit more of the Upaka kind of effect. But he manages to connect the ascetics' view to personal experience, really, because he asks them, "Have you known me to talk like this before?" So that, I think, would trigger their memories of him as a person earlier, their connection with him, and perhaps recognise that something important's happened to him, so he needs to communicate with him. Maybe they should communicate with them. Maybe they should listen to what he has to say. Okay, so then he launches into what's known as the first sermon or first address, and what's very striking for me in this is that the first thing he talks about in conveying his teachings is the middle way, and that strongly suggests to me that the middle way is his point of departure. Let me again quote to you how the text presents this. Bhikkhus, these 2 extremes should not be followed by one who has gone forth into homelessness. What 2? The pursuit of sensual happiness in sensual pleasures, which is low, vulgar, the way of worldlings, ignoble, unbeneficial. And the pursuit of self-mortification, which is painful, ignoble, unbeneficial. Without veering towards either of these extremes, the Tathagata, that means the Buddha, has awakened to the middle way, which gives rise to vision, which gives rise to knowledge, which leads to peace, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, to nibbana. Okay, so think it's worth noting here that the Buddha is addressing the ascetics. Yes, so the first sermon is preached, as it were, or told to these particular people, and their background is that they're still at this point attached to asceticism and all the beliefs that go with that. So the belief in cosmic justice, and that if you do these austerities, then you'll gain merit, and this will help you, reach a better position in the longer term in future lives. So in order to move them beyond this in the same way that he himself earlier moved beyond it, he focuses on sensual happiness and self-mortification. So the ascetics will, of course, have given up sensual pleasure and sensual happiness. So they'll be with him on that one. But then he also challenges them on self-mortification. So we could take it there, I think, that the Buddha explains what the problem is with self-mortification, with asceticism. That you're just ending up at war with yourself. You're engaged in a war which you can never win. And really that it's integration that's required here, not some sort of fight, some sort of internal fight where you try to conquer yourself, but getting all the aspects of yourself on the same side. That's the integration process that I think the middle way goes with. The address is adapted to the ascetics and their needs and their interests. Later on, in other parts of the Pali Canon, the middle way is also explained in other terms, in terms of the doctrines of eternalism and nihilism. And there's one passage also that suggests interpretation in terms of existence versus non-existence, which you also get later on in the Nagarjuna. So basically there were different ways of seeing and conveying, talking about the middle way in different contexts. But broadly, obviously, the sensual pleasures versus self-mortification one fits some key aspects of the Buddha's time and context and the people he was addressing. And that's a general point I think we have to bear in mind whenever we see the middle way discussed. That the middle way, I think, is a general universal principle, but it's going to be expressed in a particular way that's appropriate to that context. So I think the mistake that the Buddhist tradition has often made here is to take the specific application of the middle way in the Buddha's context to be a description of the middle way in general, in a universal form, to try and universalize the specific, if you like, rather than trying to see what it's an example of. So what's the more general principle behind the Buddha's approach to the middle way here. So if you take the more general principle to be one of avoiding absolutes on either side, eternalism and nihilism, sensual pleasures and self-mortification, obviously avoiding these are all examples of opposed absolutes. But there are others, and so when we come today to to look at the political conflicts, for example, in the US, where you might have extremes of view about race, for example, or something like that. This is not eternalism and nihilism. You can't slot that into the traditional Buddhist categorization of the extremes. But nevertheless, they're extremes, and the middle way is badly needed in those discussions. That's a theme I will take up more in the next talk, which is about how we understand the middle way and the limitations of the traditional Buddhist ways of presenting it. But that's all I'll say for the moment. But basically, yes, that the Buddhist tradition tends to take the Buddha's account, starting in this sutta, as the middle way in general, but I'm suggesting it's far more than that. It's a far bigger principle than that. Okay, so then the Buddha moves on, according to that first sermon or first address. He moves on then to talk about the Noble Eightfold Path and the Four Noble Truths. So the Noble Eightfold Path offers basically an analysis of the middle way. What it talks about is a range of what I would call integrative practices, what others may prefer to call spiritual practices, where different kinds of habitual activity help you to overcome deluded absolutizations and help you to integrate your perspective in the long term, improve your judgment, improve the mental states that give rise to better judgment. So the Noble Eightfold Path includes, it's a more detailed analysis, if you like, of the Threefold Path of morality, meditation, and wisdom. So it includes that range of different kinds of practices, including some about how you behave, the morality, some about how you cultivate your mental states, the meditation, and some about your understanding, the wisdom. So that again suggests to me strongly that the practice of the middle way involves interdependent practices, and obviously the Buddhist tradition has developed this a great deal. There's a lot to be learned from the Buddhist tradition in this respect. So the Noble Eightfold Path, there's a lot more to say about the Noble Eightfold Path, and there's, talk more about the specifics of it. And again, that's a further talk later in this series. I will go into the Noble Eightfold Path in more detail and how it relates to the middle way. Okay, but then the third element of the first address is to talk about the Four Noble Truths. So, and again, I think it's interesting that in the text these follow the middle way. So I would see them as they're describing effects of absolutization to be recognized and avoided through the middle way. They have been turned into truths, I think, and with a capital T, absolute truths, and by the tradition. And very often Buddhists have, in effect, put the Four Noble Truths first, so they have assumed the Four Noble Truths are truths about the universe as a whole, and then made the middle way fit into that, turned it into some other sort of claim about truths about the universe, rather than saying, well, how do these supposed truths fit into the path itself? How are they stages in the path? Or how do they contribute to the path? So in this respect, I think the work of Stephen Batchelor is invaluable. So he has talked about the four tasks, as he describes them. So he sees them not as truths, but as things to be done. So just to talk through them a bit. So the first truth or task is dukkha. The Pali word is dukkha, which is very often translated as suffering. And I think it's widely recognised that this is not a good translation. But what also frustrates me is that often Buddhists agree it's not a good translation and then carry on using it. So I think it would be better just not to use it. It means something much more, I think, more helpfully anyway. It means something like frustration. So it's a kind of negative prompt in our experience to adopt a new approach. Just like the Buddha became frustrated at both those stages in his early life. Became frustrated with the palace. He had to burst out of that. He became frustrated with the forest and the asceticism. He realised the limitations of them. So then he moved on. So independence on that frustration and recognising that frustration, moving forward, became possible. So you can understand this in relation to feedback loops. So in systems theory, they talk about reinforcing and adjusting feedback loops. So if you're in a reinforcing feedback loop, you're just going round and round. In effect, your existing beliefs are being reinforced by your behaviour and your interpretation of the world around you, and you're just stuck in that way of understanding things. But an adjusting feedback loop is where obviously something is coming in from outside to change your perspective and help you adjust what you're doing and what you believe about the world around you. So that thing that makes you change your position is dukkha. It's usually comes across as some kind of frustration or irritant or something. Obviously, it may be suffering in some major way, but it might not, be experienced as a lot of suffering. Okay, so that's the first noble truth, as it were, or first task. So Stephen Batchelor suggests that frustration needs to be understood. The task is to understand it. And then the second truth or task is about the cause of that. So where does dukkha come from? And that's, I think, very much about why we end up in reinforcing feedback loops. Why do we end up in states of craving or anxiety or delusion, so associated with fixed beliefs, which make this point of frustration necessary. Yeah. So why are we caught up in absolutizations of the kind that the middle way seeks to avoid? So traditional basic answer to that in Buddhism is craving, and the idea of craving. So again, in one of the later talks, the sixth talk, I will go into more detail about the relationship between craving as it's understood in the Buddhist tradition and what I would call absolutization. That is the tendency to believe we have the whole story, that I see as the extremes avoided by the middle way. So again, in Stephen Batchelor's way of putting it, the origin of frustration is to be abandoned. That's the task that follows that. And then the third noble truth or task is the cessation of frustration. And that's often identified, obviously, with enlightenment. So again, as I discussed the enlightenment in the last talk, that's very much about having a realization of the alternatives, maybe an archetypal inspiration of that actually makes you work towards those alternatives, actually motivates you. So the third task seems to be finding motivation, finding inspiration for doing something different, for connecting you with that new adjusting feedback loop at every point in your life. So in Batchelor's formulation, again, that cessation of frustration is realized. You have to realize it's there. You have to recognize it. And then the fourth truth or task is the path leading to the cessation of frustration, which is to be developed. So that there again, traditionally, that's the Eightfold Path. It's also the middle way. Okay, so and again, that will be when I talk in the fifth talk, will be about the Noble Eightfold Path. So all the things that I've mentioned there, I will be going into in more detail in the remaining talks of the series, because there's a lot there in the way we understand those four noble truths or tasks. But basically, I'm going to suggest that interpreting them in the light of the middle way is crucial here. Okay, so I'm already running out of time, but I want to say a little bit about the Buddha's general approach to teaching and his ministry. So the next thing is to think about how the Buddha taught generally. So here is a picture. Well, this is actually a Chinese picture of the Buddha teaching, so it's nice to have bit of a change from Thai pictures, perhaps. This is a more sort of Mahayana picture of the Buddha imagined teaching, an array of bodhisattvas, of arhats and bodhisattvas and so on. So an array of illustrious followers. But again, in the Pali Canon, it's the way the Buddha teaches that's just as important, I think, as what he teaches. And the way he teaches is obviously to try and get his hearers to themselves learn, to identify their own absolutizations and conflicts and integrate them. Yeah, so recognise what's holding them back, what's causing difficulties for them, and not to stamp on those barriers, as it were, but to recognise how to work with them, how to bring them into line with their deeper understanding. So the middle way, I think, is very much about starting where we are and going on from there. And the Buddha seemed to do that all the time. He would help people to start where they are, and he would try and use the language that they would recognise and understand, and move on from that, using that language to help them see further. Excuse me. So one of the aspects of that was quite important, I think, was just the language he used. So in the context of the Buddha's life, a lot of the religion of early Hinduism, led by the Brahmins in his time, was conducted in Sanskrit. Or Sanskrit was the holy language of the elite classes, particularly of the Brahmins, the priestly leaders of Indian society at that time. But the Buddha did not use that language. He did not teach in Sanskrit, although some of the later texts, oddly, were in Sanskrit, but that's a later development. So he talked to his hearers in what we can best call Magadhi, because he was in Magadha. Magadha was that region of India where he was, in northeastern India, or I should say, actually, to be accurate, the northeastern Indian subcontinent. Otherwise, I'll get Nepalis writing in saying that's not India. He was born in Nepal, etc. Anyway, northeast Indian subcontinent. So he spoke Magadhi, a language which was later written down and called Pali, which means a row of letters. But the important thing here is that he was speaking the language, the ordinary language, the vernacular of the people that he was speaking to, which is obviously the crucial thing to do if you want to help them. So that's why I find it ironic, really, how much modern Buddhism still is larded with Pali and Sanskrit terms. That people, for example, use the word Dharma when they could perfectly well say teachings, and they use Sangha when they could perfectly well talk about the community. So it becomes kind of a group identity thing, a barrier, rather than something helpful. And that also fits with my own experience. So I was an ordained Buddhist some time ago, between 2004 and 2008, where I had the name Upeksha Chitta, which was just, in my experience, just a complete barrier between me and the people around me in England. 5 syllables. Why did my preceptor give me 5 syllables? Anyway, so often, using the wrong language can be a problem, really, and the Buddha seemed to recognise that. So another way that the Buddha taught is the use of metaphors, and there's a whole section in my book on the Buddha's metaphors, including some quite famous ones. So the raft, the lute strings, the man with the arrow, shot with an arrow, the second arrow. So there's another metaphor about 2 arrows, and the blind man and the elephant. So these are famous metaphors or analogies that the Buddha used, which convey crucial points in a way that's very easy to relate to. And obviously those metaphors allow us to relate what might otherwise be an abstract point to our wider experience, and that's how metaphor in general works. Following the work of Lakoff and Johnson, they explain how metaphors are connected to our more basic experience of meaning, and it's basically how we develop more refined and complex ways of understanding things and more complex language. So, but the trouble is, I think, with the way, again, the tradition treats the Buddha's metaphors, they're often reduced to allegories, and sometimes the way the Pali Canon treats them is as allegories. So an allegory is simply really a story with a key. So where you say this item here in the story means this teaching. And to give you a quick example, which I quote in the book, so there's this story, quite elaborate story, told of a man fleeing in terror, pursued by 4 vipers, 5 murderous enemies, and a 6th murderer. He seeks refuge in an empty village, only to be told that dacoits are about to descend on it, etc., etc. Now, there's then a key at the end of the story. We're told that the vipers are the 4 great elements, the 5 murderous enemies are the 5 aggregates, the 6th murderer is delight and lust, the empty village is the 6 internal sense bases, and the dacoits are the agreeable and disagreeable phenomena, etc., etc. Yeah, you get the idea. So there's basically this is just a way of remembering the teachings in a formulaic fashion. But metaphors more broadly help us relate a key insight, a key understanding to our experience. So let's take the example of the raft. In fact, I've got a picture of a raft I could use to accompany this. There's a raft. Yep. It's a rather informal raft, I think, but I think it makes the point, because the raft that the Buddha was talking about was said to be kind of just hastily put together. So the raft in the Buddha's analogy is used to cross the river, and the key point is that you don't use the raft after you get to the other side. You leave the raft on the other side. You wouldn't want to carry it with you when you get into the land, the jungle on the other side. In the same way, you should be able to let go of the teachings that enabled you to cross the river. Now, that I think is a hugely kind of rich, potent image, because it's about provisionality for me in general. So in any judgment, we can apply this metaphor. So a particular set of assumptions, or a particular set of beliefs, or techniques may be helpful to us in a particular situation because it addresses certain conditions. But when those conditions are over, when they change, we're going to need another approach, and we don't need the raft anymore. Just like, for example, eternalism and nihilism in explaining the middle way in the Buddha's time, that was the raft they used at that point. It helped them cross the river, but that's not exactly how we need to use to explain the middle way now. It's a very widely rich metaphor. But the traditional way of interpreting it is just, okay, the raft is the way of crossing samsara, and when you reach nirvana on the other side, then you don't need the teachings anymore because you're perfect, because you finished the path. That's just a reduction, a formulaic reduction of that whole rich metaphor. But the Buddha's speech in the suttas is filled with metaphors of this richer kind. Okay, so the Buddha also, he used discourses, he responded to people in different ways, and he used what we could now call Socratic questioning. So there's one point where he using what you might now call CBT. It's a bit of cognitive behavioural therapy with this depressed monk called Tissa. And there's another episode where he meets this pompous Brahmin called Sonadanda, but he manages to relate to Sonadanda by using his language, by talking about how, asking him really what's the true Brahmin, and he what makes a good Brahmin, and he's able then to draw out from the Brahmin's idea of what makes a good Brahmin to what the path is like in general, and to adapt what has been said. So he finds in effect he finds the middle way in Brahmanism, and that's then again another very interesting application, I think, of the universality of the middle way, even in different religious contexts. Doesn't mean you take on the beliefs that people assume to be essential in those religions, but it does mean you can adapt the language and you can use that context and explain the middle way in different terms, outwardly different terms in those contexts. And that's exactly what I've tried to do myself in writing my book called The Christian Middle Way, which tries to, if you like, do a Sonadanda sort of in Christianity. Okay, so the Buddha asked people questions a lot of the time which lead them on to think for themselves. So he was a great educator, an early educator in that respect. And he also had a great respect for autonomous judgment. So he wanted to encourage people's own reflective awareness. And the great statement of that is in the Kalama Sutta, which is often seen as the key place which expresses the Buddha's commitment to autonomous judgment. And so the Kalama Sutta, I'm going to have to be quite brief here, but the Kalama Sutta consists in a group of people, the Kalamas, who approach the Buddha, and they're confused because they've met lots of different teachers and they don't know who to believe. They're all saying conflicting different things. So the Buddha responds. Maybe I'll just quote you some of what he says. So it's fitting for you to be perplexed, O Kalamas. Come, Kalamas, do not go by oral tradition, by lineage of teaching, by hearsay, by a collection of scriptures, by logical reasoning, by inferential reasoning, by reflection on reasons, by the acceptance of a view after pondering it, by the seeming competence of a speaker, or because you think the ascetic is our teacher. But when you know for yourselves these things are unwholesome, these things are blamable, these things are censured by the wise. And he repeats the same thing. So basically, when you know for yourself that it's helpful, and when you know for yourself that it's unhelpful, that's the basis on which you should judge. Now, I think we should interpret the term "know" there with some caution, but it's basically about experience, that when we recognise for ourselves that something is the path or not the path. And in a way, this is obvious, because how could we possibly practice it if we didn't understand it for ourselves? But it's guarding against substituting that understanding of for ourselves with just a symbol of it that takes its place. So the Kalama Sutta recognises the uncertainty that we're all under at every stage, and it questions absolute appeals to authority of any kind. It also says it's not just about reasoning. So it depends on your assumptions and your awareness, not just going through a correct chain of logic. And it's not just an isolated or rational self that makes the right judgment. It's to do with broadening your awareness, obviously, that you'll gradually come to develop an integrated sense of the path. So, to my mind, again, the Kalama Sutta is an expression of the middle way, because it's showing the relationship between the middle way and autonomous thinking, that we've got these absolute claims made on all sides. How on earth do we differentiate between them? Well, we do have to use our own judgment, but not our own arbitrary judgment, not our own limited judgment, but a judgment that is trying to develop a more integrated perspective and using new sources of information to gradually improve our understanding. So the wise, as they're described, it's not a new appeal to authority. It's people who've experienced developing wisdom. Okay, so I haven't got time here to go on to, as I suspected I wouldn't actually, to go on to the Buddha's politics or the Buddha's death. But those, again, there are chapters on those topics in the book which you can read if you're interested. So very briefly, the Buddha is not above politics. That's one key thing, and he finds the middle way in his approach to his death as well. Okay, I'm going to stop there and leave a bit of time for questions, though I can't see any in the chat box as yet. But I can give it a minute. So if anyone has any questions, please do type them in, and I will try to respond to them. So yeah, while I'm waiting for that, perhaps I could just maybe mention what's coming up then. So the next talk, which will be in a week's time on the 21st. Sorry, not the 21st, the 23rd. Yeah, 23rd will be on the interpretation of the middle way. So the limitations or issues with the traditional Buddhist interpretation of the middle way. And then there will be the that will be the fourth talk, yeah, and the fifth talk will be about the Noble Eightfold Path, interpreting that. The sixth talk will then be about craving and karma and conditionality, interpreting all that stuff, which has obviously a lot of emphasis in the Pali Canon and Buddha's teachings. And then the final talk, the seventh talk, will be about the Buddha as an archetype and how you can relate to the Buddha as an archetype. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions coming through, so I will leave it there. Obviously there are ways, if you have questions later, there are ways of engaging with me through our Facebook group, for example, or on the Middle Way Society site if you go to middlewaysociety.org. Okay, so I'll stop there for now. Thanks for listening, and hopefully see you next week.